it's interesting. Most people don't know this, but I'm just going to lay it out very, very quickly and succinctly as possible. But my roots are in the occult. I mean, I was, 13 years old when the Beatles were doing all this stuff with Eastern mysticism. I had a guru. My third eye was open. I was at Woodstock. I did LSD. I mean, I was immersed in the occult. I had spirit guides and astral projection, all this. And then finally, at 30 years old, I became a Christian, 10 years of just Bible study, Bible study, Bible study. And then I think the Lord, when I was 40, kind of, said, hey, let's go back and look at this and revisit it. So I consider myself sort of an apologist for those who are stuck in the New Age, those who believe that UFOs are from Zeta Reticuli, we talked about films. And we teamed up and we created 10 of these. And the whole purpose has always been to go in and look at all these different phenomena through a Christian lens, a biblical lens. And that's what we do in all of the Watchers. And I think in doing that, we go into places and subject matters that a lot of people would never go into.
Right.
But that's where the Lord has us, and that's what we've exposed in our films. And frankly, I'm glad we've done it. I think the supernatural world is more real than the world around us. If we were to take the prophetic narrative out of the Bible, that's almost a third of the biblical passages that are there just removed. And isn't it interesting that the prophetic thread from Genesis to Revelation has to deal with the Messiah and the seed war, the seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman. And we are in a window of time where biblical prophecy is more relevant, in my opinion, than ever before, as we are moving towards that climax in history, in all of history, the time of Jacob's trouble. And of course, you and I both believe that we're out of here before the time of Jacob's trouble happens, before the Great Tribulation. Well, but that's the idea that if the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, and when we see Joshua and Caleb going into the Promised Land and prosecuting the war, and there's that troubling mandate from a loving, holy God, go in, destroy all the tribes, men, women, and children, kill all the animals and burn them. That's maniacal, it's capricious, it's genocidal, it's murderous. But yet that mandate comes from a loving, holy God. How do we reconcile those? The moment we plug in the Nephilim, the seed war, which in my opinion manifests in the Promised Land when Joshua and Caleb are prosecuting that war, is it possible that some of the Nephilim tribes escaped, fled the area? And our hypotheses, my hypothesis has always been that that's what happened. And if true, we should find evidence of that. And I think we're finding some evidence of that. I think that the church at large has a very truncated view of the supernatural. And we dumb it down. Well, Goliath really wasn't, 9, 12, 14 feet. He was more like, 7 feet tall.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to go there. And yet, look, just on Catalina Island, I discovered a picture, and you know about this, it's on the Trail of the Nephilim, Volume 2. We discovered a picture, and it shows a 9-footer buried on the island of Catalina. That's not supposed to be there. And when we discovered the picture and we broadcast it and made it to the public, we went back to the museum, and the museum had redacted the giant out of the picture. Again, the seed war, the commingling of the seed of the serpent with human DNA, creating this offspring, an abomination known as the Nephilim. But there are many different Nephilim tribes. One of them in particular, which I find very interesting, is called the Anakim, which means the long necks. And, you talk about the best of Watchers, but one of the things that we got to do, which was absolutely incredible, we were down in Peru at Senior Juan's Paracas History Museum, the first time we were down there, and we were shown a mummy, the head, in other words, the body had already been disposed of. Who knows what happened to that? But Senior Juan had the head, and the head was still in the mummy wrappings. And we asked, well, can we unwrap it? He said no. But the following year we went back, and Senior Juan allowed us to unwrap it. And we brought in Joe Taylor and Eric Junkins, our archaeologist at the time. Joe Taylor runs the Mount Blanco Museum. And he spent the better part of 4 or 5 hours meticulously unwrapping this. And when it's a 2,000-year-old mummy, because we had carbon-14 dating on the textiles. And when we unwrapped this, we were all taken aback, startled, because the head was greatly elongated, number one. Number two, the hair color was blondish reddish, blonde red. I mean, that was the hair color. And we've actually had those hairs analyzed, and it came up U2E. Now, people always talk about contamination with DNA analyses. I understand that. But how many samples do we need to run before we can start ruling out contamination and go, wow, more testing needs to be done. U2E1 is a European haplogroup coming from the mitochondrial DNA from the mother's side of the family. That rewrites history if it holds. If it holds, it rewrites history. And we think it's holding.
You're saying that, in effect, they were fleeing from before
That's the hypothesis,
men of God,
yes.
and coming into the Western Hemisphere.
And again, the hypothesis is we think these may be a Nephilim tribe, but we don't know yet, which is why we're on the trail, which is why more testing needs to be done. We can't say yet because we've never gotten nuclear DNA. And the nuclear DNA would tell us, well, if it's an unknown primate, then we're really off to the races. It's very troubling. And I'll tell you why. Because the giant of Kandahar, and we have multiple witnesses. We now believe there's more than one. Steve Quayle broke the story before we did. But the pilot that Steve interviewed, that came up to Steve, and our shooter, two different time frames, two different locations, and that means there's two different giants. Since then, I've had other people come up to me. From ex-military or active military, basically validating the story. They've either heard about it, they had access to it, they saw something, so it's there. What's troubling about it, how old are these things? Are they actually thousands of years old? Are these the original giants that fled from the Levant? We don't know. All we know is when our shooter, who came to us, and there was a platoon of guys, they came around, this thing came out of a cave. It was over 12 feet tall. It had a pike, a long spear in its hand. One of the guys started shooting and running at it. The giant moved with such agility and speed, it took them all by surprise. It stabbed this guy, hoist him up in the air like this, and was coming after the rest of them. And then one of the guys said, shoot him in the head, like David and Goliath. Decapitation, which is essentially what they did. They shot his lower part of his head off. The giant had 6 fingers, 6 toes, red hair, double rows of teeth, and the stench was just absolutely unbearable. And a huge helicopter came in, they wrapped this thing in a cargo net, and they never saw it again. And when the guys went back and wrote their report, after they wrote the first version, they were told, no, you got to rewrite it. And they went back and rewrote it. So the shooter came to us, and he was very emotional because he lost a very close friend there. But his story corroborates Quayle's story, and since then we've had other witnesses. It's interesting. Jesus tells us to be like the days of Noah when he returns. And in my opinion, one of the spiritual flares that goes up is we need to go back and look at the Genesis 6 narrative, and it talks about the angels commingling their seed with the women and creating this hybrid offspring known as the Nephilim. And again, I think, in my opinion, if we don't understand Genesis 3:15, which you talked about at one conference, it's all about the seed was your presentation. Right. If we don't come to grips with Genesis 3:15, then we have no understanding of Genesis 6 with the flood, later on at the Tower of Babel when Nimrod becomes Geborim, later on the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and finally when the war is prosecuted into the Promised Land. It seems completely genocidal. But the moment we plug the Nephilim, this is why it's so important, the moment that we plug the Nephilim in, all of those scriptures that I just mentioned, they're just like dominoes. They all make perfect sense. I want to address that, and I'll go back to the best of watchers. When I first met Dr. Roger Lear, who passed away several years ago, it was 1998, 1999. So 1999, my book Nephilim comes out. Coincidentally, Barry Chamish's book comes out on UFOs and the Nephilim. He was not a believer, but I met Barry, and at the same time, he introduced me to Dr. Roger Lear. And I had heard about Dr. Roger Lear, who had just conducted his first implant extraction. Now, remember, when I'm talking about the idea that someone's being taken against their will at the wee hours of the morning, like 3 o'clock in the morning, they're being floated through the windows or the walls or the ceiling. They find themselves on a steel table, and there are beings that shouldn't be there. And they are implanting small devices in them. All that is the stuff of science fiction. I get it. I totally understand, except we had a man that came to us whose name was Bill, not his real name. And Bill stated that when he was 5 years old, he was taken. When they first came to him, he fought them off, the grays, the ones with the big heads and the dark eyes. He fought them off the second time, right up through the ceiling. Now, I realize people will go, Ellie, that's impossible. We've got story after story after story. And he was implanted.
Okay. Now,
40 years before
let me
he
stop
took
you
it out.
right.
And to some people, it's a troubling question. And again, those who have a very truncated view of the supernatural can't come across the line usually. I'll quote from the book of Enoch, first of all, where there's a quid pro quo when the fallen angels descend on Mount Hermon thousands of years ago, pre-flood. And in order to gain access to the women, they show primitive man the art of weapon making. That implies a foundry, technology, and everything else with
Sure.
it. In the book of Ezekiel, it talks about the Lord dispatches these two angels, and they have some sort of a weapon. That's technology once again. They have some sort of technology in which they're basically destroying Jerusalem. So, you know, when we go into, let's go back to Elijah being taken up. What is that? How does that work? Let's look at the New Jerusalem. Is that some sort of a phantom that just descends, a holograph that descends, something that, you know, that isn't real?
No.
Or is the New Jerusalem really what it is, the city? And it comes from another dimension and comes to earth, and that there's a physicality to it. The glass, you know, dimly, darkly,
Yeah,
whatever you,
yeah.
as Paul tells us. And, you know, we only live 70, 80, 90 years, and what do we really know? We know a little drop
Yes.
compared to what's out there.
And we're really talking about the best of watchers. L.A. Marzulli, Richard Shaw has done a lot of work with L.A. over the years. Let's talk about, now, I hate to even bring this up, but the black-eyed kids. Who are they? What are they?
I think, and again, look, the black-eyed kids, here's a little quick synopsis of what happens. It's around 5 o'clock, the sun is setting, it's late fall, early winter. Knock comes at the door, and you open the door. The lady of the house opens the door, and she looks down, and there's these two kids. They're dressed sort of oddly, and their heads are down like this, and they say something like, "Is it food time yet?" Which is something that normal people wouldn't
Yeah.
say. Is it food time? And the lady of the house goes, "Well, you know, what do you kids want? Who are you?" And they'll say something like, "Just let us in. This won't take long. Is it food time?" "Well, come on, kids. Who are you?" She retorts. And finally, the kids lift up their heads. And at that point, the lady of the house sees that there are no whites, that the dark eyes, and she is absolutely terrified. She slams the door, locks it, and goes, let's say, to the second floor where she looks out the window. The kids are gone. Account after account after account. First of all, we don't think, and this is we interviewed David Weatherly for this, and also a woman who actually had an encounter with these beings. We don't think that they're children. We think that they're hybrid beings of some sort. In my opinion, they are, and this is where, again, it gets very complex. The seed of a serpent will be at enmity of the seed of the woman. We believe that these are hybrid children, but they're not children. They might be decades old, but they're stunted. And the black eyes tell all. And it'd be one thing if we only had one or two reports, we could dismiss it. We are getting more reports from people. And most people, and this is what's amazing, people will go to church, but they won't tell their pastors this stuff because they're afraid to. They're afraid of the ridicule. And yet, you know, in our Bible, what do we talk about? You've heard me say this before. We talk about the supernatural. We talk about the virgin birth and floating access and talking donkeys and men that walk on water and water that's changed to wine and everything else in the Bible that's supernatural. And yet the people are afraid to go to their own pastor and tell them that they've had an experience. And they'll come to me or they'll email Richard. And, you know, that's why we delve into these subjects, because we need to begin to talk about them, not hide them. Not hide. It's one of Richard and I's favorite episodes. In fact, Richard added some footage into that which has never been seen before. Howard was an art professor. He was an atheist. He didn't believe in God. He became sick. He was in a hospital in Paris. He lay there for hours. He didn't get any help, and something happened. He basically went into a coma, and there were these people in the hallway. "Come on, Howard, let's go. You got to go. Hurry up." And he didn't know whether he was awake or asleep, but he got up and he saw himself laying there. That's the first thing. And he began to walk and walk and walk and realized that he was way outside the hospital. And it became dark and very gray. And pretty soon they started to torment him, these people. And they called him every horrible, vile things and did horrible, vile things to him. And something inside of him said, "You need to pray," but he didn't know how to pray. You know, "E pluribus unum" came to mind, that type of, "I pledge allegiance to the flag." He didn't know how to pray. And finally it was, "Jesus loves me, this I know." from when he was a little kid and
Wow.
going to in the Bible, where the kids go. And he said that, and all of a sudden, this just light just came into this dark, horrible place, and these entities who were there fled, and it was Jesus. And Jesus came over and picked him up and cleansed him off, and up they went. And he spent time. And people will go, well, that's impossible. Here's the fruit. Howard went from an atheist, he's now a pastor, loves the Lord, and has dedicated the rest of his life to bringing other people into the kingdom. One of my favorite clips that we show is our filming, and Dr. Marzulli gave us the original footage of this, of the Kumburgaz UFO incident, which happened in 2007, 8, and 9. In other words, a very large UFO appeared in exactly the same place on exactly the same date in the years consecutively, 2007 through 2009. Dr. Lear was there in 2009 with a camera guy with a telephoto lens on this thing. And they zoom in on it. You can see it right in the film. They zoom in on it. There's the moon, and there's an object. And they zoom in, and the object is kind of a gull-wing craft. It's got an opening in it. There are two beings standing inside of it. The craft rotates, it moves, and they film this. It's not like a 10-second or a 30-second, fuzzy YouTube clip. It's very clear, very sharp, and the craft moves. And they filmed it for more than 5 hours, for crying out loud. And what's interesting about this, when I show this clip at conferences, the entire audience is just completely silent. And I basically say to them, you've seen something now. Now you've got to deal with it. What are you looking at? And in my opinion, this is not some kind of delusion or illusion or some sort of phantom. This is hardcore craft with entities that are there. And what I find interesting is that about a month and a half ago, we had disclosure. Yeah. And that is just groundbreaking. We had a pilot that was trotted out with a dog and pony show, F-18 pilot, and has this thing locked in on his cameras, ready to shoot it out of the sky. It's a UFO, and there it is. And he states in that interview on Fox News with Tucker Carlson, for crying out loud, that it was real and that it was whatever that craft was not from this world. Yeah. Then you've got Harry Reid, former Senator Harry Reid, coming on the record stating that there's a government program to study UFOs. Well, what does that mean? How do they study? They sit around and read books about them? No. Are they back engineering craft? Possibly. Are there alien bodies that they're dissecting and looking for? Possibly. In other words, we don't know the depths of that. And then the government, which up until a month and a half ago has denied even the existence of Area 51, come on the record and say, guess what? Area 51 is real. We've had disclosure. And the fact that they trotted out this F-18 Fravor, the guy's name was, Pilot Fravor, who gave the order to do that? Where did they get the film to do this? This is an orchestrated, deliberate revealing of the so-called extraterrestrial. And the co-producer of this, Richard Shaw, and I, the whole point of creating Watchers was to give a biblical perspective in a non-religious way. In other words, the whole purpose of it was, Richard and I, so we could created it so you can invite your friends over who, let's say, aren't Christians and show them some of the subjects which people are talking about without hitting them over the head with the Bible, so to speak, and yet slip that perspective in. So everything in the Watchers series is always looked at, studied at, and presented from through a biblical lens, always. So that's the nexus of the whole series, is to get the word out. But we're not preachy, and we don't sit there and start quoting scripture through it. But that thread is always underneath, and if for those who have eyes to see, and definitely that's what we try to do. I mean, one of my favorite clips in the whole film is when we're actually taking out that little metallic implant in a guy who we call Bill, not his real name, in his knee. And the cut of a chase here, and we take it through the whole process. And I remember when I first started talking about this and discovered that people allegedly were being abducted. Now, there are those who will say that, well, they're really not taken. Well, if they're not taken, how did this implant come in? Well, it's really not an implant. It's really not there. Oh, really? So we did a very in-depth study. We have x-rays, we have CAT scans, and we take the viewer in Watchers 7 and Watchers 8, and you can see all this, and the best of Watchers, through the whole process with Bill. Guess what? There's the little object below his knee on the x-ray. The same thing is in the CAT scan. We take a Gauss meter. This little piece of metal is giving off a reading of 8.0 milligauss on the Gauss meter. Richard's fully charged camera battery is only 10. How's
the
that
Gauss
possible?
meter, I should point out to our viewers that the Gauss meter measures electrical radiation.
So how was that working? And what amazes me is that little implant, when we tried to take it out in the operating theater, it wasn't there. And when I prayed, and my prayer was this: Father, if there are forces that are cloaking this device, I pray that you would break it and do it soon. Less than a minute later, all of a sudden, the picture of the implant comes in on the monitor, and we were able to extract it. The implant was metallic, but it had some sort of a rubbery case around it. I mean, this was a very, very complex little device which was placed in this man's knee over 40 years ago now, and the body did not expunge it because of this case. Nefarious interdimensional entities, those of us who are biblical students would call them fallen angels. When you say fallen angels to people, most people don't have a grid for that, so they don't know how to process that. We're talking about highly intelligent, nefarious entities which are perhaps hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years old, and that they're interdimensional, and they have the ability to play with space, time, and matter and energy. They can change it. They can maneuver it. They also can appear as different entities, different. In other words, they can appear as an angel of light, as the Bible tells us. But there is a physicality to all this. When people are taken out of their rooms, here's an example, and I've used this many times. Peter's in a jail cell. An angel appears to him. That's real. That's not a phantom. Peter's chained to the wall. All of a sudden, the chains drop off. The guards are switched off. The prison door opens up by itself. The huge prison gates open up by themselves, and the angel disappears. There's physicality there. The angel is appearing and manipulating space, time, and matter and energy. That's not demonic delusion or an illusion. It's real. There's a physicality to it. Well, the fallen angels are doing the same thing, except theirs is a nefarious agenda. And I think these implants, and people have scoffed at this, but this is what I firmly believe. I believe these implants are DNA changers. They will change the host DNA, and I think they are the forerunners of the mark of the beast, which is a 3-hour conversation, but that's what amazes me. And I wrote about this little sidestep here in the Cosmic Chess Match, that the reason why, in my opinion, that God hardens Pharaoh's heart over and over and over again. Pharaoh goes, well, let him go. And then God hardens Pharaoh's heart, is to show the Israelites who he really is and what he's capable of doing, knowing full well that in the not too distant future, he's going to bring them all up to the promised land, and they're going to see what's there, and they're going to turn tail and run. And they do that. But that generation dies off. It's 40 years. A new generation comes up, and they go in and prosecute the war. And what we see is there's a supernatural element to the prosecution of that war.
Absolutely.
Think of Jericho.
Yeah.
That's absolutely astounding what happens to Jericho. And Jericho, to me, is a Nephilim stronghold. That's what it is.